Hello there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Changing Minds podcast. My name is Owen Fitzpatrick, and today I'm going to argue with you. I'm only kidding. I would never do that, but I am going to teach you about how to win arguments. And what I want to do in this particular episode is I want to share with you some of the research behind, well, what works in terms of winning over other people to our perspectives, and in a very specific context, because I want to start off by saying, the first thing to know about winning arguments is that the ideal thing is to minimize the likelihood that you're in an argument in the first place. And the reason I say that is because a big part of changing beliefs, a big part of persuasion will not happen through the logical arguments that we try to push forward. Indeed, a lot of persuasion happens and a lot of influence happens when a person doesn't feel like we're arguing. They just slowly but surely start to change their mind. Again, like we've talked about before, you don't change another person's mind, you create conditions whereby they change their own mind. And arguing is not much different to that. The only main difference, I suppose, with regards to arguments is there's an unspoken contract, an unspoken agreement between you and the stakeholders that you're talking to, or the people you're talking to, stakeholders. You can tell by me talking and using the word stakeholders that I'm spending far too much time in meetings, in boardrooms. But when you're talking to the other person, whoever that might be, stakeholder or someone who's holding on to chicken instead of steak, do you get it? See what I did there? Anyway, if you're talking to them, you want to be able to maximize the likelihood that you're able to win over that person's perspective. And oftentimes when we're arguing with someone, the aim is that you're arguing for a particular reason. You want them to see your point of view. You want them to accept where you're coming from or believe what it is that you want them to believe. But the unspoken contract or agreement is that you're going to have a conversation, you're going to have an argument, you're going to weigh up the concepts, the reasons, the evidence together so that you can reach a mutually positive conclusion from your engagement, from your interaction. And that also sort of implies that you're going to do this using logic and using reasoning and using arguments in order to be able to figure out what's going on. So in many ways, why to argue is arguing needs to be something that you're doing that will help you achieve your goal. And the context needs to be right. When we're talking about winning arguments, the first type of argument, the first lesson about arguments is that it needs to be the type of argument that one person can win, or both of you win by agreeing. But it needs to be something that both of you are pursuing the truth. And if you come to the table and both of you are trying to figure out what's really going on, trying to figure out what the best decision is, and you both are willing to listen to each other and both are willing to challenge each other and both are willing to explore that, then you're in the perfect position to argue as successfully as you possibly can. So I wanted to start off by that because I think a lot of people, they overuse argument. They try to persuade people through argument all the time. And as I mentioned before in the podcast, changing minds is largely about the peripheral route, the automatic system one route, the way you make people feel, as opposed to the logical argument that you have to put forward. There's great information. There's a lot of great books about winning arguments. Two great ones I can mention is Jay Heinrich has a great book called Thank You for Arguing. And there's another one more recent by Mehdi Hassan called Win Every Argument. And both of them, I suppose, look at some of the most important skills that you need to have or the things that you need to bring to the table if you're to be as effective at winning arguments and winning people over. Every argument has to prove two things. It has to prove that the claims that it makes are true and those claims support the conclusion. So it's not just about coming up with a logical argument. It's about making sure that the claims that you're saying, the evidence that you're using is accepted. The source of those pieces of evidence is accepted before people will actually accept the conclusion that you're drawing from all of that. It's important to realize that you're always arguing, generally speaking, about facts, judgments, or prescriptions. So facts are you're arguing about what actually happened. Judgments are you're arguing about what decisions should be made. And prescriptions are you're arguing about how to solve this particular problem. And in those cases, arguments can be valuable, once again, if both parties are in a position where they're open to having a conversation, a good discourse about what the best thing to do is or about what really went on, and they're open-minded enough to listen to each other. The first thing to know about being really skilled with arguments is that you want to be able to think in terms of ensuring that you have three core points to make. A lot of the TED Talks out there are about 18 minutes or so. They're making an argument. They're suggesting a certain way of thinking, an insight, a big idea. And oftentimes they'll have three sort of smaller ideas that feed into that bigger idea. The rule of three, as it's known, is not just good from a rhetorical standpoint where you're repeating A, B, and C, but it's also something that tends to work quite well when we're trying to solidify our message and get people to buy in. We also want to leverage the power of storytelling. Most of the conversations we engage in are in the form of stories. A lot of research out there that suggests our primary way of communicating to each other is in the form of gossip, which is, of course, telling stories about what's going on. So mastering the art of telling stories is a crucial skill to master if you're trying to put across an argument, because even when we're talking about, let's say, inverted commas, logical arguments, we're talking about putting forward perspectives or ways of thinking with evidence and whatnot. It's not just logical. We still will have the peripheral route. We still will have the emotions that will be impacting and influencing whether or not we believe other people. You are never purely arguing in logic. And the reason is because as human beings, we are always influenced by other factors, influenced by the way we feel, influenced by certain biases, or as they're known in the argument world, fallacies that affect the way in which we interpret whatever evidence comes our way. So 2 core skills: make sure that you're very clear about the main ideas that you have, and make sure that you're leveraging the power of stories. So you're giving them plenty of examples. You're not just giving them data or statistics or pieces of evidence. You're making that evidence or data or statistics, you're making it meaningful for the listener as effectively as you can. Arguments tend to be sometimes around blame. So you argue about who's to blame for something. Not always useful unless it's necessary to punish someone to help you moving forward. You might argue over values, what's most important in this situation, and you might argue over the decisions you make, the choices that you make in a situation, right? Who did this? Who should do this? And what's the best thing to do out of the choices we have? Those are the kinds of things that we might look at and argue. Also, Aristotle, we've talked about him before. The 3 things he talks about: ethos, logos, and pathos. Ethos, we'll talk about in a moment, but that's the credibility of the speaker. There's the logos, the illogical appeal of the argument, which is a big part of arguing, and pathos, the emotional appeal of the argument, which again is an undervalued but yet crucially important way of putting across your message effectively. When we get into the ethos, we have to realize that a big part of being successful in your arguments is not actually the argument itself. A big part is how persuasive you are as a person. And we've looked at this before in terms of how you can persuade other people or influence other people. But being great and successful in terms of arguing needs to start from ethos in terms of, are you demonstrating virtue? Are you showing that you've got shared values as the other person? Are you connecting with them and showing your experience, showing your expertise? Are you demonstrating the right kind of appearance? All of those factors will influence how people perceive the arguments you give. So these peripheral, irrelevant, one might say, elements do influence how people listen to you, how people perceive you, and whether or not people are likely to argue with you. So often a big part of winning an argument is not about the message itself. It's about challenging the other person's credibility or maintaining and demonstrating your own. And this isn't just in terms of demonstrating your own credibility there as well. There's a few advanced techniques. For example, there's reaching a reluctant conclusion. In other words, when Mark Antony, back when he gave that speech, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, I've come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." And then he went on for the rest of the speech pretty much praising him. That was such a powerful speech. And it was powerful because it was emotive as opposed to what they'd heard from Brutus, right? Which was all the facts and all the logic and all the reasons why Caesar was killed. But Mark Antony used and leveraged the power of pathos and emotion in the stories he told about all of the great things that Caesar did. But what also made it valuable is that he was also conceding, he was reaching a reluctant conclusion. So it almost appeared like he didn't mean to say what he believed. It's just, this is the conclusion he reached. And I think that's something that we could learn a lot from, is that instead of going through going, this is definitely true, walk people through how you reach that conclusion. And if you can make it so that you didn't want to reach that conclusion, but you had no choice to, it becomes ever more powerful. This is also when you involve personal sacrifice here, right? You show how this conclusion isn't necessarily good for you. the conclusion you're reaching, the conclusion you're putting forward. If you can show how you're not incentivized to believe it, that can be very, very powerful as well. So that can also convince a lot of people. And making sure that as you do so, you're demonstrating sort of authenticity. It basically means that people aren't assuming that you just have this agenda that you're trying to push. Instead, you're simply disclosing what your experience was. You also want to share in terms of your own personal wisdom, show your experience and your selflessness and some of the good qualities that makes you come across as the kind of person that they can trust and the kind of person that knows what's going on and is being open enough about it and is letting other people reach that conclusion. Sometimes one of the techniques used to do this is asking questions that the answers to those questions are exactly what you want people to know. A lot of times lawyers or attorneys will do this when they ask questions whereby the witnesses are the ones building the argument for the attorney. So the attorney doesn't have to seem like the argument's coming from the attorney. It feels like the argument's coming from other people. So these are some great examples. There's also another really cool technique called, I think it's synchresis, and it's conceding a point so you'll build trust and be able to come back later with a stronger point. So this means finding any flaw in your argument and bringing that up and accepting that it is a flaw and leveraging that so that the fact that you've admitted that it's a flaw makes you more persuasive as an arguer because you're willing to be vulnerable in that case and people trust you more. And then when you do come back with a stronger argument, they're more likely to believe you because they remember that you've been honest about something that you knew that you were wrong about. So that is powerful there. But like I said, it's not just about your own credibility. It's also about the credibility of the other person. So if you're trying to win an argument, one of the things you might want to do is challenge the speaker and challenge the credibility of the speaker. This is also known as the ad hominem technique. And it is based on this fallacy that oftentimes we'll win arguments by simply challenging the credibility of the speaker, even if the speaker is making a lot of sense. So you'll challenge their credibility, you'll challenge their expertise, you'll challenge their authority, you'll definitely challenge their intention. So you look for malintent, like they want to deceive the audience. You look for examples of hypocrisy. You say this, but at the same time, you're doing that. You look for conflicts of interest. Well, of course, you would say that because you also want to achieve this. And you'll look for every example you can to show why the other person is not to be believed. Now, in an ideal world, we would not pursue these lines of attack because it's not a fair way of doing an argument. At the same time, just because it's not fair doesn't mean it's not done. And if you don't do it, likelihood is the other person is going to do it. So the argument there is the credibility of both sides is something that we need to consider and something that we need to factor in and discuss if we are to be as effective as we can be in that way. Often in an argument, you look for the middle of the road solution. And this means you want to appear, especially when there's an external audience, as the most reasonable person in the room. To do so, you want to be careful how you describe the average perspective or the average point of view. If you talk about the average point of view as extreme, the likelihood is that you're extreme. If you describe the average point of view as someone who's somewhere in the middle and you're quite accurate and honest about that, then people are going to be more likely to perceive you as more reasonable. But whenever people put forward going, this is what it's like, or even the word mainstream media, and the fact that most people are hoodwinked by this, that suggests an extreme point of view. They're declaring that the average person is in this category of extreme brainwashing. And that immediately takes away from their credibility because we intuitively will know that most people aren't. Most people might be watching media, a certain type of media, mainstream or whatnot. But we also know there's an awful lot of nuance in that. So when someone makes a claim that the average is quite extreme, that immediately will take away from their credibility if we can point that out and get people to realize that that's what they're doing. Whenever they do that, one of the best ways to challenge it is by asking them questions, by pushing for details, by asking them to be able to explain why their conclusion is that most people are of this extreme perspective or point of view. The next thing you want to be doing is appealing to the audience. So appealing to the people that you're trying to win over, whether that's the other person you're arguing against or whether it's the audience that are listening in. And the first thing you want to do is find the truisms of the audience. This means what are the true things that the audience will agree with? and try to focus on what you have in common. Focus on the areas where you know the audience will agree, and try to make sure that as you're communicating, you're leaning into that. You're being very effective at connecting to what you know that they'll agree with. You also want to showcase yourself as the bigger person. Don't allow yourself to be swayed by emotion or get angry or lose your temper. You want to always be the bigger person so that, once again, the audience can identify you as the most virtuous, therefore someone that they want to relate to. You want to be able to use strong emotions and to leverage the power of stories and whatnot to be able to make them feel powerful. Once again, emotions are very, very effective in influencing how people come to the conclusions they do. So you need to be really skilled at leveraging powerful, strong emotions to change how people feel. You want to talk about the future. You want to be able to describe the vision that you have and the difference between what you're saying versus the other person, particularly important in politics. You paint a picture of what if you're right versus what if somebody else is right. And you're using logos or logic along the way to bring people through the conclusion so people not only feel good about what you're saying and feel that it's correct, but also they can logically justify it to themselves. Part of what will help them to justify it to themselves is what we call the language of arguing. And the language of arguing is really about the word choice that you use along the way. We've talked already about using more emotional language or using emotion in the way you communicate. Well, you also want to be able to take control over the terms that other people are talking about. So you want to redefine the opposition's terms. And we can see this happening all the time. Whenever, for example, if you take abortion, some people on, let's say, people that are against any form of abortion will describe themselves as pro-life. And people who are for the choice of women to be able to decide what they're going to do with their bodies, they will describe themselves as pro-choice. So you're talking about pro-choice versus pro-life. And sometimes you talk about, well, some people are anti-abortion. The other side is not going to turn around and say we're pro-abortion, but they'll say we're pro-choice. It's the distinction of using the language which gives you an advantage in that way. And so we need to recognize what is the language we're using to describe our own point of view, and what is the language that the other person is using to describe their point of view, and how can we use language to reduce how persuasive their point of view is, to be able to position them differently. We can create our own terms which suit us, which make us come across as more reasonable, more impactful, more credible, more persuasive. We need to be clear if we are doing that to define the terms that we use, or sometimes what they use, to our advantage. And we need to create the definitions, because you can define terms in such a way that it gives you an advantage. Or you can define terms in the way that the other side does and gives them the advantage. But the definition of terms is something that in an argument you have the ability to do, as is labeling. When you label the other side, or you label an argument, or you label a person's point of view, you're controlling how people perceive that, because the label itself becomes the very way that people think about it. If we talk about the idea of estate tax or death tax, it's the same type of tax, but one of those terms creates much more impact than the other. A lot of euphemisms work like this. A lot of terms like collateral damage is a nicer, softer way for the government to say, you know, we accidentally murdered innocent men, women, and children. Or if we talk about friendly fire, we accidentally shot one of our own. It's a softer way of describing something that was really, really horrendous. But by using a different label, it changes how people feel about it. And so we need to be careful of the logic or the language that we use in that moment. And in terms of reasoning, primarily we got inductive reasoning, which is bottom-up observation. So we make observation 1, observation 2, observation 3, and that means the conclusion. But we also have top-down argument known as deductive reasoning, where you go, this is true, and this is also true, therefore this is true. So it's almost like going, all humans breathe, and John is a human, John breathes. Because the first statement is true and the second statement is true, we can then deduce that the third statement is true as well. So once again, slight differences between inductive and deductive, but they're both ways to be able to put across our arguments. The other thing to be aware of is we also have fallacies. And these are sort of biases that we have that influence the way in which we think about things logically. In other words, we assume that when we're arguing, we're fully logical, but there's a lot of little games we can play and a lot of cheat codes, if you will, where you seem like you're being logical, but you're not. So what are some of these that you can listen for and then point out to win your argument? First of all, we have what's known as the false dilemma or false dichotomy. This is you give people a wrong number of choices. You can either do A or B. You can do X versus Y. You create this sort of polarization. A lot of times it's done in the media, whereby it's you're either with us or against us. It's either this or that. It's either black or white. The reality is usually gray. Usually the reality or the truth in most arguments is actually somewhere in the middle. But because of polarization, because people like the extremeness, people like sort of sensationalism, what they'll do is they'll give you a choice. You either A or B, and that's your only choice. There's also, whenever we are reaching a conclusion with evidence that's a bit shaky, or certainly we can't connect the evidence to the conclusion, that's known as bad conclusion, right? It's when we're using weak proof. We say, because X and Y, therefore Z. Well, actually, no, X and Y doesn't necessarily lead to Z. And so we're pointing out that just because this and this is true doesn't necessarily mean the other thing is true as well. There's the fallacy of power, or this notion or tendency we have to believe because a person's in a position of power and they say it, it's more likely to be true. Or false analogy. This is when we give examples or metaphors, analogies really, whereby we say, oh, well, the brain is just like a computer, which could be a useful analogy. But if you get too ingrained in it and you act as if the brain is exactly like a computer and you fail to consider the neurochemistry and all of the other interactions that make brains different than computers, when you go too far down that loop, it becomes a false analogy. And there's an area where it's no longer helpful or useful or accurate. And when we fall into that trap, it's very easy for us to say, oh, the brain is just like this, therefore this. Well, not necessarily. We have to explore that analogy and make sure that it fits in that situation. You also have the slippery slope fallacy where they say, oh, as soon as people do this, it immediately will lead to this. So for many years, this was done about marijuana. The more people that smoke marijuana, the more likely they are to inject heroin. When you look at the research out there, there's not an obvious connection between marijuana and heroin. The only potential connection might be that when it's illegal, two things that are legal might be sourced from the same person. But marijuana doesn't make people more likely to be addicted to heroin, for example. So it's an example of the slippery slope. Once again, it seems logical when we hear it, but it's not necessarily accurate in that way. You have the straw man fallacy, which is this notion whereby we're taught the other person's argument in a very simplistic way, and it's a very weak argument, and therefore we feel more superior because we believe, oh, their argument is not nearly as strong as mine. Well, that's because you've heard the straw man argument. You haven't heard their strong man argument. You know your own strong man argument, but you don't know theirs. So if you want to be better at persuading people in an argument, you should do your due diligence and know what the other person's strongest argument is. There's also what is known as the Chanticleer fallacy. And the Chanticleer fallacy assumes that if one thing follows another, the first thing caused the second. So this is when we mix up causation and correlation. So we think A caused B because A and B happen at the same time. There's lots of examples whereby two things are happening at the same time or one follows the next, but it's not necessarily caused by that. I often talk about the law of causes and effect, which suggests that there's a multitude of causes for a lot of effects. And as long as we generalize and say, oh, this cause led to this effect, we're making an error. And that error could lead us to make incorrect assumptions and incorrect decisions of what we're going to do as a result. So we need to recognize that just because B follows A doesn't mean that A caused B. It could be correlated, or it could just be that A is one of a multitude of factors that cause B, or B just could have spontaneously happened, and it just so happened it happened right after A. So we need to recognize these kind of things as well, these fallacies. Finally, some basic tips in terms of if you're going out there to argue successfully, besides buying the books I recommended earlier. Thank you for arguing and win every argument. Is number one, be very clear. Be very clear what your argument is, what your evidence is, and how your evidence proves your conclusion. What are your claims? How does it all work together? Make sure you're super clear of all that. Be clear of the weaknesses of your argument. Be clear of the weaknesses of the opposition's argument. Be clear of the strength of the opposition's argument. And by having all of that before you actually go into the argument, you're going to put yourself in a really advantageous position. Stick to the point. Don't allow yourself to get lost or find yourself going off course. Make sure you're clear. You stick to the point. You repeat the message over and over again, which makes it more persuasive. Make it personal and use stories. Sprinkle in stories along the way and make it relatable to the people you're talking to or the audience. Make it so that they can connect with it and they relate to it and they're affected by it. Speak to their needs. Spend a bit of time thinking through what is true for the audience, and make sure you're connecting what is true for the audience with what you want them to believe. And be more fluid with your presentation. There's a thing called the fluency effect, which suggests that rhythm, rhyme, repetition, and even how natural or automatic or effortless a presentation is makes people more likely to believe it's true. So it's almost like the cosmetics of the presentation influences how persuasive it is. So whenever you're making an argument, always remember that it's not just about putting forward your own reasoning. They're going to have just as good reasoning. It's about how you make people feel about your argument, about you, about the message you're proposing, and it's about how well you tie that to what's important for them. When you do this, you are going to win so many more arguments. But if it's a case of winning arguments with your significant other, you're on your own there. For now, take care, be well. I hope you found this useful. If you are interested in reading from me as well as hearing from me, I have a weekly newsletter called Inner Propaganda. Really cool, designed to provoke a different way of thinking in your mind. You can get that by going to owenfitzpatrick.com/newsletter. But for now, take care, be well. Please rate and review the episodes if you're enjoying them. And may the force continue to be with you, and may you continue to believe better. Bye for now.